Yeah, really inspiring talk, and one that also fills me with some sort of trepidation and anxiety. And one of the questions that I wanted to deal with is, how do we confront that anxiety? The problem is and can seem overwhelming. And so what I wanted to talk to you about in 10 short minutes is a course I put together for grad students. I put it together when I came out, when the IPCC report came out in 2018, when I was on sabbatical, and I was wondering what to do. And I thought, 12 years from now, if I look back and my children or even grandchildren ask me, what did you do in the intervening years between when that report came out and now, or what would I answer? The first thing I took comfort in is that action is the antidote to depression. And I'm sure that you've heard that from many different quarters. Getting involved, staying involved is really, really important in order to maintain kind of a sense of optimism and also a sense of positivity, and to see what we can do, because I do believe there's a lot that we can do. And I believe the world is also shifting. Although we do see the rise of Trump and Trumpism and Modi and other authoritarian movements around the world, we also see Black Lives Matter. We also see Standing Rock. We see a whole range of Indigenous movements. And so I wanted to say, although I won't go into this too deeply in the talk, I think that climate justice is important. Anti-racist and anti-decolonial action is important, not only because it's the right thing to do, but it's the smart thing to do, because so many of these peoples have witnessed the destruction of their own environments over centuries and have mobilized and developed strategies to fight these events, and we should see them as much as allies, even as they are importantly victims of the climate crisis. So action is the antidote to depression, but what to do? I started really thinking in terms of some of the work of Marshall Gans, who was a really important organizer and academic at Harvard. And what he says is, the first question an organizer asks is not, what is my issue, but who are my people? Effective organizers put people at the heart of their efforts. Who are we organizing with? Who are we organizing for? Effective organizers create and work with communities, groups of people with a shared interest, and constituencies who are standing together to realize a common purpose. And this is from his great piece on organizing people, power, and change. So to that end, with my students, I thought, well, who am I? Who are my people? My people are students. My people are the academic community and the larger community within the Greater Toronto Area. And what I wanted to do was mobilize some of the really important thinking on climate justice, on activism, so that we together, my students and I, could hone our skills, could think about, could learn from past actions, and could also work with climate organizations, climate activists in the local area to help them in their causes. So students could gain capacities and tools for organizing, but also they could also balance, and I don't know if there are any student activists in the audience, but sometimes the load between climate activism and academic pursuits is absolutely unmanageable. So we have to think about how to insert climate activism into many different aspects of our life. And we have to think about ways to connect to climate activist organizations, to mobilize student talent and energy and excellence working with them. I'm going to talk briefly about who we worked with, but really around 3 different issues. How to develop effective messaging strategies. We worked with Climate Pledge Collective around their bank switch initiative. How to work on building emerging capacities for leaders, for youth leaders. And we worked with an extraordinary group called Generation Chosen which is an organization that works in the Jane Finch community of Toronto, which is a mostly young people of color, and is developing climate literacy and leadership capacities among these youth. And we also worked with Climate Justice Montreal, which is largely a student-led group that was interested in thinking more deeply about strategies for coalition building among the many different organizations that that we find in our midst. And I think that's actually both a source of excitement and also a challenge for us in climate activism, is not that nobody's doing anything, but there's so many different groups that are doing many things. But the question is still, how do we hold governments accountable? How do we pressure them to do the right thing? I'm just going to go quickly through what we did with these different groups. With Climate Pledge Collective, there is a bank switch campaign that's going on with Climate Pledge Collective around encouraging both people and organizations, community organizations, institutions to shift their money out of the 5 major banks in Canada. The tools that we developed were messages around what we call diagnostic framing. So what is the problem? Prognostic framing, what should we do about this problem? And motivational framing, why should we keep doing it? So Bank Switch is a campaign to pressure Canadian banks to stop funding the expansion of fossil fuel industry. And I was surprised to learn from my students just how heavily involved the 5 major banks are in this, are involved in the tar sands. The campaign is mobilizing people to contact their branch managers and tell them they will be switching to a more sustainable bank, usually a co-op or a credit union, by April 2021. The first important thing in diagnostic framing, the nature of the problem, the Big 5 finance 2/3 of the financial support for the tar sands. It's an extraordinary amount of money from Canadian banks that is going into this, this enterprise. So getting the word out, our students developed infographics for this campaign to make people aware of that. They also developed materials on how to organize, how to switch your organization's bank, how to switch your individual bank, how do you message your bank manager. They have templates for calling the manager, for writing the manager, for developing a plan for pulling your money from those banks. And finally, in order to keep people motivated in this effort, they developed a lot of documentation on the way that some of the major financial institutions, whatever we think about them, are now suddenly concerned about their fiduciary responsibilities. They are deciding that fossil fuels are perhaps a risky investment, and are announcing that they are divesting probably in ways smaller than we would like, but divesting nevertheless from oil sands and other drilling activities. The second group that we worked with is Generation Chosen. Generation Chosen is a nonprofit organization devoted to enhancing the emotional intelligence of young adults from underserved communities. And I think if we're talking about building an intersectional movement, working with really extraordinarily talented and intelligent and skilled organizations like this is something that we need to consider in the climate movement. What they do is work with young people in the Jane Finch area of Toronto, young people from age 15 to 25, and develop support structures for them to help them navigate institutional and systemic barriers, biases around as they confront anti-Black racism, and help them engage in meaningful education, discussion, and activities, both around mental health and emotional intelligence. What our students did was helped work with Katie Williams developing a climate toolkit for them. This climate toolkit was for the Tuesday evening class of Generation Chosen, which really is a Tuesday evening class where students are in a constant state of learning, reminiscent of the idea of distributed organizing. This is an organization that is really motivated around youth empowerment and leadership building. And the toolkit that our graduates developed encourage students to employ storytelling, advocacy, and public narratives in framing climate initiatives. So this is just a brief kind of look at what they did, giving students some of the basics on what climate change is, diving into the deeper causes, looking at some of the youth-based organizations around the world. Although Greta Thunberg is sort of very popular in the northern media, there are a lot of young people in the global south who are hugely involved in climate initiatives, and helping them frame and understand how they might want to frame climate advocacy projects. So really, this is about creating the next generation of leaders in climate action. And this program was delivered through 9 weeks of virtual classes and occasional guest lectures. It really followed the model of Marshall Ganz's model of leading for change. Ganz talks about 3 practices for successful leadership: relationship building, creating a mutual commitment to a shared future. And this is a very time-intensive and long and involved process one has to commit to. The second practice he talks about is developing a public narrative, a story about, not just about the sort of global, the global crisis that we're facing, but connecting your kind of personal involvement to it and your motivation to answer the question of why this matters, not just why this matters for the world, but why this matters for the individuals who are committing to be involved in this struggle for change. And so a narrative like this, he talks about, enables you to exercise agency, to map out scenarios in which experiences and objects and symbols are codified, in which you start to think about what the sort of personal connections are to this larger issue. And finally, we worked with Climate Justice Montreal on coalitions and allies, and the idea of surviving together. And surviving together isn't just about sort of surviving the climate crisis, but the idea that we worked on with Climate Justice Montreal was not only to articulate a common opponent, and I think that the previous speaker really narrated that very well, that the strategy of identifying a common opponent, corporate greed, government intransigence, is really, really critical, but also to begin to be mindful of hierarchies of subjugation that may even be internal to the movements that you're trying to connect with, or that as you connect with them, that not to recreate hierarchies of subjugation within your coalitions, to be really, really aware of that. Finally, they looked at strategies to foster communities of care across different communities. And I think in the under the situation of the pandemic, I think we're finding that even more a significant point of connection across racial divides, across different kinds of unequal communities. And then lastly, and I think this is really, really something important in terms of why coalition building is the smart thing, not just the right thing to do, and climate justice is the smart thing, to learn from local knowledges, to learn how and with different peoples about how they've survived previous crises, what works for their communities, how to build with them, not just not presume that we are building for them, and to learn from their deep expertise and experience. And I think the previous speaker actually covered some of the other reasons for building these coalitions, that you really we want to counter the rise of fear-based populism that happens when people get truly desperate. But also, and I'm thinking of scholars like Winona LaDuke and Kyle White, who are both Indigenous scholars, to learn from what other people know, what other peoples know in their history of dealing with environmental racism and dealing with these kinds of injustices. I'm probably moving too fast through this, but fast is maybe not a bad thing. Finally, I think it's important to understand that we can also, in this work, find common ground. There are places where unlikely alliances can form. And I'm referring in particular as a wonderful study done by Zoltan Grossman, where he looked at examples of native and non-native environmental alliances between ranchers and Indigenous peoples. And particularly around things like the Keystone XL pipeline. Winona LaDuke, who wrote a foreword to his book on unlikely alliances, noted that one of the principal components of creating a successful alliance was not just identifying a common enemy, but having a common, in this case, the love for the land was something that united people in this common struggle. Okay, there's more I could talk about. There are ways that strategies and tactics of supposedly under-resourced organizations can sometimes be more effective than large, heavily funded institutions. And Marshall Gans did a great study on workers' alliances around the grape boycotts. There's the idea of forging sticky policies. Sticky policies are policies which are not subject to the sort of flip-flop of, one government gets voted in and they institute a particular policy and then they get voted out and another government changes that policy. One of the ways of ensuring sticky policy is through legislation. And in the United Kingdom, I'm sure you're familiar with the 2008 Climate Act, which had some impact on holding government's feet to the fire, no matter who got in. The other way to promote sticky policies is to build entrenched constituencies. So, for instance, if you were to launch a training program on training workers in solar power, in the manufacture of solar power, or if you start to build a constituency that will support that policy. Another example is in the US, for example, in trying to institute something similar to healthcare, as sort of a, sorry, my dog just came in from the door, but in trying to institute something akin to a Canadian-style healthcare, one of the things that governments did, which was fairly easy, was to keep young people up to the age of 26 on their parents' healthcare. So that started to build a sense of normalcy around that policy. We could also talk about sustaining activism and strategies for building momentum from not only from successes, but learning from failures. And I think I will stop there and hand the floor back to Avi.
Thank you, Susan.